By 2024, the palaces of the Great World Fairs exist mostly as light on a screen. In a quiet reading room overlooking the Seine in Paris, digitized glass negatives from the Exposition Universelle of 1900 open one by one. The Palace of Electricity, the Château d'Eau, the illuminated gateway at Place de la Concorde. Official histories describe these structures as temporary pavilions, built of staff, plaster over iron and wood, meant to dazzle for a few months and then be demolished. Yet in the photographs, nothing about them looks temporary. At night, the facades read as carved stone, domes and arches solid against a black sky, their outlines traced by thousands of incandescent lamps. The gateway is crowned by a statue of La Parisienne, glowing under a halo of light, while the Palace of Electricity rises behind a curtain of water and colour, its generators hidden inside. The official captions speak of progress, spectacle, national pride. The images themselves show a complete, coherent city that appears older than the date stamp beneath it. One plate, taken in late October 1900, is labelled simply Night View, Champ de Mars. On paper, the buildings around it should be gone within weeks, dismantled and recycled for material. In the frame, however, the geometry feels deliberate. Domes are lined along the river, towers echoing the Eiffel lattice, a continuous band of light running like a circuit around the fairground. The long exposure has turned individual bulbs into a steady halo, a silent corona of electricity around masonry that officially never quite existed as real architecture. The air in the reading room is still, but the old image seems to hum. Water freezes mid-fall. Light becomes a solid surface, and the fairground reads less like decoration than like a switched-on machine. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. As the screen goes dark between images, the city that once stood there flickers, on, off, like a system being quietly shut down. Between 1853 and 1870, the centre of Paris was remade under Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann, prefect of the Seine under Napoleon III. What visitors walk today, the grand boulevards, the uniform cream-coloured apartment blocks, the diagonal avenues opening to monuments, was constructed in less than 2 decades, replacing a dense medieval city that has stood for centuries. The official justification was sanitation and order. Cholera outbreaks in 1832 and 1849 had killed tens of thousands. Revolutionary barricades had been raised in the same narrow streets in 1830 and 1848. The new geometry, straight lines, wide perspectives, defensible junctions, serve both health and control. Tens of thousands of buildings were demolished, nearly 20,000 new structures replaced them, along with hundreds of kilometres of new sewers and water mains. What vanished in the process is harder to measure. Churches were relocated or torn down. Entire neighbourhoods were expropriated and cleared. The maps in contemporary archives show the transition starkly. Tangled medieval fabric in one year, rational grid in the next, with no intermediate step. A reporter for Le Figaro in the 1860s described watching workers pull down buildings whose construction methods no one present could identify. Walls thicker than any modern requirement, cut stone fitted without mortar that resisted the wrecking bar. The official records do not contradict this, they simply do not dwell on it. Progress moved forward, and what lay beneath it was labelled obsolete. Today, drone footage of Paris shows the Haussmann boulevards as elegant veins through the city. For some contemporary researchers, however, the uniformity raises questions. The repeating window rhythms, the identical facades across kilometres, these look less like new construction than like a standardised overlay on something older. This is the Tartarian reading, a speculative lens through which certain observers view the same photographs. The pattern began long before the term existed. By September 1900, the banks of the Seine had become something impossible, a complete city built for a single summer. The Exposition Universelle drew over 50 million visitors to Paris between April and November. They walked beneath the gateway of La Parisienne, rode the moving sidewalk that looped 7 meters above the ground, and stood before the Palace of Electricity as coloured water cascaded down its facade after dark. The official guides were explicit. These buildings were temporary. Their walls were staff, a mixture of jute fibre and cement, over iron skeletons. They were designed to be dismantled when the gates closed in November, their materials sold or recycled. Yet the photographs tell a different visual story. The domes, the arches, the colonnades all appear as solid as the permanent stone monuments across the river. The Palace of Electricity rises 5 stories, crowned by a star, its generators humming inside while its skin glowed with 10,000 lamps. Panoramic photographs from that autumn show the trottoir roulant, the moving sidewalk labelled Rue de l'Avenir, the street of the future. It carried passengers at 2 speeds around the entire fairground, a continuous loop of electric conveyance that would be torn apart within weeks of closing. The photographs freeze it mid-motion, visitors in bowler hats and long dresses gliding past illuminated pavilions. Contemporary accounts describe the hiss of early arc lamps, the clatter of wooden platforms, the damp night air by the Seine picking up the coloured light around the Château d'Eau. The fair ran for 7 months. Then the system was switched off, the structures disassembled, and within 2 years the Champ de Mars was open parkland again. Only the Grand Palais and Petit Palais, built in stone for permanent use, survived. The rest became memory, photographs, and a handful of decorative fragments scattered across Parisian parks. For Tartarian-aligned observers, this is the first major question. Were these palaces truly built from scratch for a summer, or were they temporary only on paper? The documentary record is consistent about materials and timelines. The visual record, however, suggests a coherent architectural language that appeared fully formed and then vanished. 7 years before Paris, another instant city had risen and vanished on the shores of Lake Michigan. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago on May 1st, 1893, commemorating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. Nearly 200 structures formed what newspapers called the White City, neoclassical pavilions, colonnades, and domes clad in white staff, reflecting in a central basin under the glow of hundreds of thousands of incandescent lamps. The scale was staggering. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building alone covered over 30 acres, briefly the largest building in the world. At night, visitors walked through a landscape that felt, by contemporary accounts, like a dream of ancient Rome rebuilt in electric light. The Electricity building demonstrated alternating current systems that would soon transform American cities. A single switch inaugurated the illumination, and the White City blazed into existence. Photographs from 1893 show the Court of Honor at night. Domes and columns mirrored in black water, every architectural line traced in light. The fair closed on October 30th. By the following summer, fires and deliberate demolition had removed almost everything. The Palace of Fine Arts, built more solidly as a museum, survived. Today, it houses the Museum of Science and Industry. For visitors in 1893, the White City was a prophecy, a glimpse of what American cities could become. By 1894, it was rubble, yet its visual language seeded the Beaux-Arts civic architecture that spread across the country in the following decades. Courthouses, libraries, and train stations echoed the proportions of buildings that had existed for only 6 months. From a speculative Tartarian perspective, this repetition is suspicious. A perfectly proportioned, electrically illuminated city appears, demonstrates a complete architectural vocabulary, then disappears, leaving just enough fragments for later architects to copy. Official history calls it a fair. Alternative readings see a pattern: build, exhibit, erase. The pattern extends backward in time to geometries that predate the great expositions by centuries. Across Europe, star-shaped fortifications and ideal cities survive from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, their outlines visible today in satellite imagery as perfect multi-pointed forms surrounded by modern sprawl. Palmanova in northeastern Italy was founded in 1593 as a Venetian fortress. Its 9-pointed star plan remains intact, radiating streets converging on a central hexagonal piazza, bastioned walls calculated for overlapping fields of fire. Neuf-Brisach in Alsace was designed by the military engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban and completed in the early 18th century. An octagonal star with concentric rings of fortification, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Bourtange in the Netherlands, Almeida in Portugal, dozens of others scattered from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, all share the same geometries, the same radiating symmetry, the same sense of deliberate precision viewed from above. The archival record is consistent about their purpose. These were military constructions, responses to the gunpowder age, when medieval walls became obsolete and angled bastions offered the only defence against cannon. Treatises on fortification from the period explain the mathematics in detail. The anomaly is interpretive, not documentary. The same radiating geometry appears in places where the military rationale was later forgotten, where earthworks survive but official signage barely mentions them, where the star shape has become ornamental rather than functional. Satellite photographs show several of these star cities in a single frame, their geometries unchanged while highways and suburbs surround them. Haze drift over some, others are sharp against cultivated fields. Speculative Tartarian readers focus on how these star-like plans echo decorative motifs in later expositions and city layouts, the concentric avenues of Paris, the radial boulevards of Washington, the ring paths of the 1900 moving sidewalk. From star fort to star-like boulevard system, the same geometry persists through centuries and regimes. The shapes remain readable from space, still walked by tourists who rarely look up at the walls encircling them. In December 1931, a different kind of erasure took place in Moscow. The Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, one of the largest Orthodox churches in the world, its golden domes visible across the city, was dynamited on Stalin's orders. Newsreel footage from the period shows the explosion in stark black and white. Masonry collapsing, dust rising, a monument that had taken 40 years to build, reduced to rubble in moments. The official rationale was ideological and practical. The cathedral, consecrated in 1883, was a symbol of Tsarist Russia and Orthodox faith, both targets of Soviet atheism. The site was designated for the Palace of Soviets, a planned skyscraper intended to surpass the Empire State Building and be crowned with a massive statue of Lenin. The palace was never completed. The foundation pit flooded repeatedly, and by the 1960s, the site had been converted into an open-air swimming pool. the Moskva pool, where Muscovites swam in heated water through the winter, steam rising into the cold air where the domes at once stood. After the Soviet Union dissolved, the cathedral was rebuilt in the 1990s on its original site, using surviving plans and photographs. The new structure, completed in 2000, is a close replica, yet the materials are modern, the proportions slightly adjusted, the interior paint still fresh. Visitors today stand beneath domes that look like the ones in 19th century photographs, but are not the same domes. During the demolition and subsequent construction projects, marble from the original cathedral was reused across Moscow, in metro stations, in public staircases, in walkways where commuters pass without knowing what they walk upon. Memorial plaques listing war dead from the original church ended up as paving stones, only recognised decades later during restoration work. Some of these fragments are now collected in a small museum near the rebuilt cathedral. Others remain embedded in the city's infrastructure, their inscriptions worn smooth by millions of footsteps. For proponents of a suppressed architectural order, this reads like literal disassembly, a resonant structure ground into steps, its material aura dispersed into everyday circulation. A monumental building destroyed, its pieces scattered, its site transformed repeatedly, its form eventually replicated in new materials. The pattern continued into the mid-20th century, now under different names. In the United States, the Housing Act of 1949 authorized what planners called slum clearance, the demolition of neighborhoods labeled as blight to make way for highways, housing projects, and urban renewal. Similar programs operated across Western Europe in the decades following World War II, replacing bomb-damaged and aging districts with modernist blocks and automobile infrastructure. The scale was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced in American cities alone. Entire districts, often historic, often densely populated by working class and minority communities, were erased and rebuilt. The official language emphasized progress, modern housing, improved sanitation, economic development. The photographs tell a different story. Wrecking balls swinging through ornate brick facades, families watching from sidewalks as their buildings come down, highways cutting through neighborhoods that have been continuous for a century. Planning maps from mid-century American cities show color-coded blocks marked clearance area overlaying 19th century street grids. The buildings scheduled for demolition are not distinguished by condition. Entire zones are marked for removal. The archival record is coherent on intentions: health, safety, modernization. It is quieter on the loss of older building stock that might have preserved earlier construction techniques, ornamental traditions, or spatial arrangements. Residents photographed their neighborhoods before and after. The street names remained, but the architecture cycled completely. A city could be overwritten in a decade, not once, but repeatedly, each layer burying the last. Alternative Tartarian readings see this as a second wave of erasure. After 19th century modernization removed medieval fabric, 20th century renewal eliminated what fragments remained of a more ornate, masonry-heavy urban environment, replacing it with concrete, glass, and highways that severed former alignments. Across different decades, different ideologies, different continents, the same result: older, denser, more ornamented architecture, giving way to something cleaner, simpler, more forgettable. The question of what counts as temporary deserves its own consideration. World's fairs and international expositions produced hundreds of monumental structures between 1851 and 1940. Most were explicitly designated as temporary, built in cheap materials, scheduled for demolition after closing. Yet the category shifted over time, and the line between temporary and permanent proved surprisingly fluid. The Palais du Trocadéro offers a case study. Constructed for the Exposition Universelle of 1878 in Paris, it was built as a permanent structure, stone and iron, twin Moorish towers flanking a vast concert hall seating over 4,000. It hosted events across multiple expositions, including the 1889 fair that introduced the Eiffel Tower. Photographs from 1900 show waterfalls cascading down its terraces, decorative animals lining its gardens. Then in 1937, it was demolished to make way for the Palais de Chaillot, a modernist replacement built for yet another exposition. A permanent building used for 60 years was erased to create another permanent building that still stands today. Meanwhile, structures designated as temporary sometimes survived. The Eiffel Tower itself was meant to stand for only 20 years. Scheduled for dismantling in 1909, it remains. The Grand Palais and Petit Palais, built for the 1900 exposition, were constructed in permanent materials and still anchor the Champs-Élysées. The Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago, later the Museum of Science and Industry, was the only structure from the White City designed to last. The rest, the domes, the colonnades, the basin reflecting electric light, existed for 6 months and then vanished. Calling something temporary can function as a license to erase it without public grief, even when, in form and scale, it resembles the great masonry complexes of older cities. Complete architectural ensembles appear, anchor major events, then vanish, leaving only fragments in parks, museums, and odd corners of modern cities. Each layer of demolition, Haussmann, world fairs, ideological destruction, urban renewal, has its own official reason. Together they form a repeating rhythm: build, illuminate, erase. Before we examine the technologies themselves, one more anomaly deserves attention: the buildings that look too old for their official dates. This is not a matter of falsified records. The archives are consistent, but of visual incongruity. Certain 19th century structures, photographed within years of their supposed construction, appear weathered in ways that suggest decades or centuries of use. The observation is speculative and must be framed as such. Atmospheric pollution in industrial cities could age stone rapidly. Construction techniques varied. Some facades were deliberately antiqued for aesthetic effect. Photographic processes introduced their own distortions, exposure times, chemical development, the quality of the paper. Yet the question persists in certain alternative communities: why do some of these new buildings look so old? Photographs from late 19th century American cities show civic buildings, train stations, and libraries constructed during the Gilded Age in Beaux-Arts and Romanesque revival styles. The official histories are clear. These structures were designed by named architects, funded by documented sources, built by recorded contractors. Yet the visual impression, for some viewers, is of excavation rather than construction, as if the buildings were uncovered rather than raised. This is the heart of the Tartarian hypothesis, not a falsified archive, but a misread one. The theory, which must be neither endorsed nor rejected here, proposes that a previous civilization built the ornate masonry structures that 19th century industrialists claim to have constructed, that world's fairs were exhibitions of inherited infrastructure rather than new invention, that the systematic demolitions of modernization were acts of erasure rather than progress. The evidence offered is circumstantial. The speed of construction, the uniformity of style, the visual age of supposedly new buildings, the suspicious pattern of demolition. Mainstream historians reject this interpretation. The construction records exist, the architectural drawings survive. The contractor's invoices are preserved. The theory requires a conspiracy of silence across governments, professions, and generations. A conspiracy for which no documentary evidence has emerged. What follows is a speculative lens, a way of reading familiar images that produces unfamiliar questions. The pattern may mean nothing more than coincidence, economics, and the human tendency to rebuild. Yet the images remain, the domes, the arches, the radiating streets. They recur across continents and centuries, in structures labelled temporary and permanent, military and decorative, sacred and civic. Whether they represent a lost civilization or simply a persistent human preference, the geometry persists. If architecture can be read as more than shelter, then certain buildings functioned as instruments. The great dome structures of the 18th and 19th centuries were not merely decorative, they were acoustic machines designed to carry sound across vast interior spaces without amplification. The physics is well documented. A dome focuses sound at its focal point. A whispering gallery, like the one in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, transmits a whisper along its curved wall to a listener on the opposite side. Bell towers were calculated to project their sound across miles of countryside, their bronze tuned to specific frequencies, their chambers shaped to amplify and direct the resonance. Church acoustics were a studied discipline. Treatises from the period explain how vaults and arches could project a single voice to a congregation of thousands. Cutaway diagrams of great dome interiors, St. Peter's Basilica, the Pantheon, show the path of sound from choir to congregation. A single bell, strike decaying into a long metallic echo, a choir note sustained under stone. The faint vibration in an iron railing when a low frequency is sung. These are documented phenomena, not speculation. Alternative Tartarian-aligned interpretations suggest that such buildings formed part of a broader system of resonance and signalling, that the geometry was not merely aesthetic, but functional in ways the official record does not describe. Mainstream scholarship sees religious, civic, and aesthetic aims at work, but the original acoustic design is rarely preserved intact. Restorations replace original materials. Microphones and loudspeakers alter the sound field. Climate control systems introduce background noise. The cathedrals still stand, but their original acoustic environment, whatever it was designed to achieve, has been modified by layers of modern intervention. A visitor today hears the space through contemporary additions. The stone remains, the silence has changed. The bells still ring in some of these buildings. Whether they ring as they were originally meant to is a question that remains suspended. We return to the fairs, now focusing on their electrical systems. In Chicago on May 1st, 1893, a single switch was thrown and the White City blazed into light. Over 100,000 incandescent lamps illuminated the Court of Honor, powered by 12 large generators producing alternating current, the system that Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse had championed against Thomas Edison's direct current. The fair was a proving ground. Within a generation, AC would power the world. In Paris in 1900, the Palace of Electricity took this demonstration further. The building itself was the message, a 5-story facade covered in lamps, its generators visible through glass panels, its towers crowned with electric stars. The Chateau d'Eau, the water castle, used electricity to pump coloured water through illuminated fountains, creating a spectacle of light and motion that visitors described in terms approaching the religious. Contemporary accounts speak of pilgrims approaching an altar, of witnessing a new kind of miracle. Technical illustrations from the period show the scale of the machinery required to illuminate a single building. Mainstream historians describe these events as triumphs of industrial progress, public demonstrations that built consumer confidence in electrification. Both fairs framed electricity almost religiously, not just a utility, but a force, not just power, but illumination, embodied in architectural form before being dispersed into the everyday grid. Speculative Tartarian readings point to alignments of illuminated domes, towers, and fountains as elements of a coherent energetic architecture, a system rather than a display. In both Chicago and Paris, electricity was not hidden in back rooms. It was made visible, monumental, ceremonial. And then the monuments were torn down, while the grid they introduced spread silently beneath cities that forgot what the spectacle had looked like. What remains today are the everyday wires and substations. The temples that once expressed electricity as symbol and form are gone. The infrastructure survived while the architecture vanished. Across Paris, Chicago, and dozens of other cities, pieces of the great expositions remain, relocated, repurposed, often unrecognized by those who pass them daily. The Grand Palais and Petit Palais still anchor the Champs-Élysées, their glass roofs and stone colonnades preserved from the 1900 exposition. The Art Nouveau entrances to the Paris Metro, designed by Hector Guimard and first installed for the same fair, remain in use, their cast-iron arabesques now protected as historic monuments. In Chicago, the Museum of Science and Industry occupies the former Palace of Fine Arts, its neoclassical exterior the sole survivor of the White City. Statues and decorative elements from demolished pavilions appear in parks and private collections, their original context lost. A walking tour of contemporary Paris reveals fragments everywhere. A carved stone animal relocated from an exposition waterfall to a museum garden. An iron gate that once stood before a temporary palace, now guarding a public park. The metro entrance at Abbacis, still functioning over a century after its installation. Records document the auctions and relocations of exposition pieces after each fair closed. Nothing here is hidden. The anomaly is perceptual. The original ensembles, the complete cities of which these objects were part, are rarely reconstructed in the public imagination. Each fragment is contextualized as a curiosity, a survivor, an antique. Few visitors to the metro think of the moving sidewalk that once looped above the fairgrounds, or the palace of electricity that rose where apartment blocks now stand. For those who read these fragments through a Tartarian lens, modern cities are palimpsests, traces of a previous architectural order scattered across parks, stations, and museum courtyards, their coherence visible only to those who know what to look for. Whatever technology might have been embedded in form, resonance, and geometry, whether purely symbolic or something more, has not vanished completely. It has been broken apart and normalized. The pieces remain, the system is gone. History is written in bound volumes, planning reports, exhibition catalogues, and later syntheses. What survives in these documents defines what we remember. What is omitted, summarized, or recategorized shapes our blindness as much as our knowledge. Standard histories of Haussmann's Paris celebrate the creation of the City of Light, with less attention to the precise buildings lost. World's fairs are remembered for technological marvels, less for their wholesale erasure from the landscape once the gates closed. Urban renewal is taught as modernization, with displacement and destruction often treated as side effects rather than defining features. The speculative Tartarian reading enters here explicitly as an outsider voice. Researchers who look at the same photographs and maps but ask different questions. Their conclusions about a lost global civilization or advanced energy system remain unproven and outside mainstream scholarship. Yet their insistence that erasure itself deserves attention aligns with a broader, documented pattern. Cities are remade, and certain kinds of architecture repeatedly disappear. The same 1893 or 1900 images are republished across decades, each time captioned differently, once as celebration, later as nostalgia, now sometimes as evidence in speculative arguments. The photographs do not change, their framing does. What one generation calls progress, another calls loss, and a third calls cover-up. The images remain available, and their interpretation continues to evolve. The past is preserved in archives, but preserved selectively. What was not written down, not photographed, not catalogued, that silence is permanent. Aerial shots drift over star-fought towns, Palmanova, Neuf Brissac, Almeida, their geometries unchanged while modern life flows around them. Trams cross Haussmann boulevards in Paris. Tourists descend into metro stations through Art Nouveau gates. Worshippers enter the rebuilt Cathedral of Christ the Saviour in Moscow, standing beneath domes that replicate what Stalin destroyed. Families picnic outside the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, the last survivor of a city that existed for 6 months. A star city, a dome, a preserved pavilion, a reused stone, a metro entrance. Each is labelled with its date: 1593, 1853, 1893, 1900, 1931, 1995, the present year. None of these dates contradict each other. Together they sketch a long-term process of construction and erasure, appearance and disappearance, preservation and loss. No voice claims that Tartaria definitely existed. What has been presented are documented facts. Repeated episodes of large-scale demolition, temporary grandeur that looked permanent, a persistent architectural language of domes, arches, radial plans, and illuminated palaces that appeared, dazzled, and vanished. The speculative suggestion remains just off screen, that what some now call Tartarian cities may simply be the most resonant expression of this pattern. Structures that, for whatever combination of political, economic, and ideological reasons, became too charged with meaning to survive intact. Bells ring in the distance, from a rebuilt cathedral, from a preserved tower, from somewhere beneath the ordinary noise of the present. If history is written by survivors, it also depends on what survives. What we call erasure might only be the visible edge of a deeper, older pattern, one that is still shaping the cities we walk through today. The light on stone and water fades. The archive closes quietly, but the evidence was never destroyed.